Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this fireside chat around EV batteries in India. Before we start off the conversation, I would just like to take 5 minutes to introduce our organization, Avendus. We are a financial services firm in operating in four businesses: investment banking, wealth management, asset management, and credit solutions. The core philosophy is to support an entrepreneur through his journey of building up a company. On the investment banking side, we focus primarily on M&A and private equity syndication. We are the most prolific deal makers in the country, closing FY22 with close to 50 deals. We are divided sectoral, where we focus on different sectors within the sector teams. EV has been a very important focus area for us over the last 4 years. We have a very strong belief on the space, and that's why we started covering it very actively when it was in a rather nascent stage in 2018. We have a 4-member dedicated team covering EVs. Through our journey of covering this space, we have developed a strong domain knowledge, both by working on secondary materials, as well as having interacted with over 100 EV companies till date. We also understand the investment landscape there pretty well, having spoken to more than 100 investors who are looking at the EV landscape in India today. And we hope to leverage that understanding to support the EV landscape through investments. As I mentioned earlier, we are strong believers of the exponential growth that we are about to see in the EV landscape, and one natural derivative of that growth in the OEM space is the battery space. So today we are going to have a discussion around how the battery space in India is panning out. And for that, I have a very special guest, the founder of Log9, which is India's only advanced battery tech company, with me. And we will be spending the next 15 minutes discussing various aspects of the EV landscape in India. Welcome to the fireside chat, Akshay.
Thanks, Koushik. Thanks for having me over.
So to start off, Akshay, I just wanted to lay out the landscape of the Indian battery ecosystem to our audience, right? So today, globally, there is almost 700 gigawatt hour of lithium-ion battery capacity globally. The projected demand by 2027 is expected to be about 2,000 gigawatt hour. And the capacities that have been announced by the majors in the world are actually far more than that, probably north of 3,000 gigawatt hour. However, in India, we still have zero battery cell manufacturing, and the most aggressive demand scenarios probably range between 50 to 75 gigawatt hour market in 2027. Do you think we are falling too far behind in the global EV battery race?
Yeah, I agree with you. We are falling behind in terms of the overall volumes that we are seeing in the market. What I believe is that the demand from a vehicle perspective, as well as batteries, are not just required for electric vehicles, they're also required for grid level energy storage, as we are targeting 100 to 500 gigawatt of renewable energy generation on the grid. And without batteries, it won't be possible. So from that perspective, over the next decade, there'll be far more demand of batteries that we are currently able to project. As you had seen, like the kind of projections that were put forward in the two-wheeler, three-wheeler industry, and from an India perspective, every company, every sector has kind of overshot those projections. And from that perspective, the kind of demand will be far higher than the 50, 100 gigawatt hour kind of number that we are talking about in the Indian context as far as 2030 is concerned. But at the same time, I'm not surprised by this kind of an outlook, because traditionally we have been very conservative. At least our larger industries have been very conservative about any new sector. And only when significant volume is there, then we set up local manufacturing. Typically, we want to depend on more of trading processes rather than manufacturing processes in the get-go of any kind of new sector. But hopefully, we'll have more and more manufacturing coming up, and it will be larger than 100 gigawatt hour, which is currently being kind of planned for or projected for at the moment.
Got it. I think the general feeling when we speak to some of the other players in the ecosystem, whether it is an OEM or an aggregator, is that EV in India today is a very supply side constrained problem, and the demand is far higher than what either a battery manufacturer or the OE can provide. Right now, if you were to solve that problem and match up the demand from the end user, what do you think are the few key challenges that the Indian battery industry needs to overcome?
So one of the key aspects is that all the technologies, all the battery technologies, whether at a cell level or a battery pack level, right, the way they have been designed, they were never designed keeping the Indian requirements in mind, whether it is the kind of weather conditions that we see in the country, or whether it's the type of vehicles that we use, or the type or the way the vehicles are used in the Indian context. It's very different from what you see across the belt from US, Europe, China, Korea to Japan, right? And that's the reason whatever electric vehicles, batteries have been already deployed in the Indian market, while the demand is definitely high, but the retention or repeat customers, so to speak, in that segment are not very high at the moment. And the primary reason is people who have bought electric vehicles, they have not been able to realize the same kind of performance or reliability as they would see in a typical ICE vehicle in that sense. And all of this primarily stems from the way the battery has been made. Because if you look at batteries which are deployed across the temperate belt or the developed nations of the world, right, over there they operate in a much lower average temperature, whereas in India the average temperatures are typically above 40 degrees Celsius in that sense, and the battery life can literally get to less than half in that 10-degree shift. At the same time, we are not putting these batteries significantly into four-wheelers and beyond, whereas our requirement is more on the smaller vehicle platforms, from two-wheeler, three-wheeler, or entry level four-wheelers in that sense. And from that perspective, the stress and the strain on the battery pack is far higher, because there is no scope of putting up any kind of thermal management in the battery or any other auxiliary systems into the battery pack. And because of that, these batteries tend to degrade faster. They have lower performance, and also we cannot support much higher charging time in the conventional batteries. So that has been the biggest challenge, and for the industry to really solve the supply problem as compared to the demand side, it is very important to make sure that we develop technologies ground up, and both at the cell level as well as at the pack level. There has to be local innovation that needs to happen so that we can set up manufacturing and then provide it reliably to the customer.
Understood. Got it. My next question, Akshay, is around policy, right? We have seen a lot of positive intent from the Indian government to push the EV adoption, and that's across the board, really. I mean, there have been subsidies at a central level, state level. There have been incentives around manufacturing, PLI schemes. Do you think the Indian policymakers are doing enough for the battery ecosystem specifically? And do you have any suggestions for what else can be done to support the Indian battery industry?
So I think the government has been putting forward various policies to incentivize EV adoption and better and better batteries to come into the picture, right? As you mentioned about the PLI scheme, both on the battery side as well as on the auto side. Even if you look at the auto PLI, it's more skewed towards electric vehicles in general, right? And on the battery side, incentives are being provided to kind of scale up manufacturing, and that's the reason we are seeing at least 100 gigawatt hour of local capacity being kind of at least planned for, right? And the only this thing is, it is very important to look at all of this scenario from a very precise in a very precise manner, so to speak. Because just to give you an example, right? Today, the way FAME subsidy in the country is structured, it's only structured around the size of the battery pack. right? It doesn't matter whether the battery will last for 1 month, 1 year, or 10 years. The subsidy is the same, right? So a lot of vehicle manufacturers have even resorted to the scenario that just get the cheapest battery available. We'll pack more of it in the vehicle, get more and more subsidy, and we don't care whether the battery will even last 6 months on the vehicle platform, right? So those kind of scenarios are happening, and that is a very big misuse of public money as well as government incentives, and it will also create a very big mistrust into the from the early adopters point of view in the EV space. So whatever policies are coming up, the intent is right. I have absolute confidence in the way government has been pushing for EVs and renewable other renewable solutions coming up in the market. The intent is very much there. What is required is to be more aware of how to structure these policies and these incentives so that we are not kind of shooting ourselves on the foot as we look back 5 years later, 10 years later, that what we have done in the country.
Understood. Understood. Coming closer to what Log9 is working on, right? Next stage battery technologies. Now, if you look at it globally, there are lots of companies which are early stage, have created a lot of value for investors. I mean, many of them are multi-billion-dollar companies working on technologies like solid state, silicon anodes, super caps, fuel cells, and so on and so forth. In that context, where do you see the future of the current lithium-ion technology, and how do you think will this landscape evolve over the next, 5 to 7 years?
So there are a lot of innovation happening globally as far as the lithium-ion space is concerned in that sector itself, as well as alternatives to lithium-ion are being developed around sodium-ion. Then you have various kinds of fuel cells coming in. There are flow batteries which are being developed upon, right? But if you look at globally, again, even the new innovations which are happening are more targeted towards the requirements in US, Europe, China, and in these places. Nobody is bothered about what is required or what would be more reliable and viable in the Indian context or in a larger sense across the tropical belt of the world. Because as I mentioned, the weather conditions are very different. The requirements are very different in this context. So if you look at solid state batteries or you look at silicon anodes, right? The whole initiative or motivation over there is to pump in more and more energy into per kilowatt hour of the battery itself, rather than saying that okay, whether this battery can run efficiently in a hotter climate or an extremely cold climate, right? That is not the consideration. At the same time, how fast it can be charged, there is still more work happening on that side. But can you provide it a solution wherein you can go with smaller batteries and rather charge them multiple times during the day and run a viable commercial operation on a vehicle like a two-wheeler or a three-wheeler or a small four-wheeler in that sense? Because primarily, if you look at it, right, the purpose to go for electric vehicles is to reduce carbon emissions. And battery is the most polluting part of the entire manufacturing process of an electric vehicle. So if you just go for larger and larger batteries, you are defeating the purpose. And rather, if you have smaller batteries which can be charged frequently and very fast and provide a very long life, that will enable us to kind of clean up the entire mobility scenario much faster and more efficiently. So from that perspective, that's what we are focusing on, to create batteries which are more relevant for the Indian context and tomorrow for the entire tropical part of the world, wherein we can provide not only 9 times faster charging, which is as compared to a couple of hours of charging time, bringing it down to 15 minutes, 0 to 100%. And at the same time, providing a life which is more than 15,000 cycles, or more in more simpler terms, something which is as compared to 2 years of battery life on a platform like three-wheeler, as compared to that having a battery life of more than 15 years and potentially up to 30 years in that sense. So that brings in that reliability and that performance guarantee for the early adopters, and that will create more and more demand in the market, and we will see numbers soaring from a penetration perspective as far as EV is concerned.
Great. I think I have time to squeeze in a last question. So moving away from e-mobility for a second, we are talking about batteries, and batteries are also at the heart of the overall clean energy transition, right? And that brings us to to the grid level energy storage, which is linked to the renewable generation. How do you see the stationary energy storage solution landscape evolving in India? And how, also for the benefit of our audience, if you can also explain how different is the stationary energy storage from the mobility applications, and then get into the landscape, that would be great.
Absolutely. So first, let's spend 10 seconds to understand why batteries are required for renewable energy generation, right? Today, renewable energy generation cost is from a solar or a wind farm is typically around 2.5 rupees per unit of electricity, right? Whereas a coal-powered plant would generate electricity at something around 6.5 rupees per unit of electricity. Still, any sensible person would say, then why are we not having all renewable energy generation on the grid? Because if it's 1/3 the price, then the entire government, the entire industry should be incentivized to kind of adopt all solar energy generation on the grid itself. The challenge with solar and wind is that they are intermittent sources of energy, right? So you will see solar generation happening only 4 or 5 hours more efficiently in a day, whereas the demand is 24/7, right? And hence we see limited scale of solar or wind generation on the grid. Today, our renewable energy mix is just 30% in the Indian context, right? But the 30% is installed capacity, and only 18% out of that is the total energy produced from renewable in a year versus the non-renewable sources of energy. And that's where the challenge starts to happen, because these are intermittent sources. You need somewhere to bank the energy generated during the day and then use it throughout during the daytime, and use it throughout the 24 hours of the day in that sense. So that's where batteries become important. One thing which is very, very crucial for our stationary storage, grid level storage, is the ability to have batteries which can run as long as the solar plant itself is running. One of the big challenges is the replacement of batteries, which typically happens in 2 to 3 years, 4 years time in that sense, whereas a solar plant will have 25 years plus of expected life. And that leads to a significant cost of battery storage at the grid level. That's the reason why we don't see much of installations in the Indian space. And again, the weather condition has to play a factor. So just to give you a basic analysis, right? As I mentioned, 2.5 rupees is the solar energy generation cost, right? In the European or the US context, right? The additional cost of battery storage along with solar generation will lead to a total cost of energy production to around 5. Batteries are deployed in the Indian context, the overall cost goes to more like 7 rupees. And that is primarily happening because batteries deployed in the Indian weather conditions, right, they degrade much faster. So you have more and more replacements coming in, and hence the cost of the electricity produced goes up. Whereas if you have batteries, the types that we are providing at Log9, then you can expect a life of battery deployment at a combined with a solar or wind farm to be close to 20-25 years in that sense. And then again, you can go back to a price point of around 4.5-5 rupees of total cost of energy generation and storage. And that becomes a viable business model for all the stakeholders involved.
Great. Thanks, Akshay, so much for sharing those insights on the battery industry in India. I hope as a country, we can work towards securing a robust battery industry in the country. Thanks again for joining us for this chat. I hope the audience found it useful to hear to all the insights that you shared. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Koushik. Thanks everyone for listening in.
Thanks.